So hello and welcome to this event at the 45th session of the UN Human Rights Council. We will discuss today the impact of faith on LGBTI people during the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Caroline Ausserer. I'm a journalist, diversity trainer and moderator based in Germany, Berlin. And since today is a special day, and for that I want to pass it on quickly to the executive director of one of the co-organizers, Tony Kruger Ayebazibwe.
Hi everybody, I just wanted to say today is the Jewish holy day Yom Kippur. So before we start, we'd just like to acknowledge that and to wish everybody observing Yom Kippur a meaningful holy day. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. This side event gives you opportunity to listen to speakers from all around the world. 90 exciting minutes await us. But before we kick off, some announcements. First of all, I'd like to thank the delegations to the UN of Canada and Fiji, which co-sponsor this event. Secondly, I'd like to thank the following co-organizers: Global Interfaith Network, ACT Alliance, Church of Sweden, CUC Netherlands, and ILGA World. And last but not least, I want to thank two colleagues who were mainly responsible for the organization of this event and who are helping me with the moderation today. Those are Umayma Dermoumi, intern at the Global Interfaith Network, and Simon Petitjean, Programs Officer at GEMRIP. For your information, we will record this event and it will be available online on YouTube afterwards. In order to make this a safe space, the chat functions are disabled. I think so. And for the overview, after introductory remarks from the ambassador of Fiji, our panelists will bring their expertise and realities from different regions of the world. The concluding remarks will be held by the independent expert on protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, Victor Madrigal-Borlos, and we will finish with Q&A. So again, a very warm welcome to all of you. So if we talk about the impact of faith on LGBTIQ people during the COVID-19 pandemic, we can state that the pandemic has been used in some countries to justify increased police violence and wide state-led repression. So anti-rights messaging has been deployed by some political and religious leaders. Also, homo and transphobic rhetoric is being spread in some parts of the world and amongst various faith traditions. Well, we can point out that the LGBTIQ community has been particularly impacted by increased violence and discrimination. So we have been made scapegoats for the health crisis. We've even been accused causing it. And in the first part of our side event, that's why we like to ask, what is happening now and what does this to the LGBTIQ people? So in our first round, we will talk about personal and regional experiences and the impact of harmful conservative rhetoric and practices. Then during the second round, we want to discuss about the ways to resist it, how to face growing authoritarianism and fundamentalism, as well as how to bring about inclusive systemic change. So let's kick it off. For the opening statement, I'm very glad, and I call upon the permanent representative of the Republic of Fiji to the United Nations, Ambassador Khan. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. And I'd like to thank all of the co-organizers of this event, and both Fiji and I know Canada. We're very proud to be co-sponsors. It is often said that we never see the true nature of the human face until there is a catastrophe, an emergency, a crisis. Sadly, what we have seen in crises is that those individuals and groups who are already vulnerable and discriminated against by society are made even more vulnerable when faced with difficult situations. When already limited resources are allocated, a crisis renders even more difficult the access of vulnerable individuals and groups to the resources and services of the state. We already know this from the data available to us because of disasters, pandemics, and slow onset climate change. Sexual and gender minorities are impacted in two ways. One is in the lack of their voices during the making of the decisions, and the other in the lack of access to services and resources during the events, both in the procedure and in the substance. We also know that in countries like Fiji, the faith of our people in God, in our churches, has remained unwavering. Fiji learned this because of Tropical Cyclone Winston in 2017. And the lessons we learned show us how important it is to engage with sexual minority activists and organizations, but just as importantly, how crucial it is that faith-based organizations should work with such groups to ensure that faith is not used as a vehicle for further marginalization and discrimination. Even more central is the role of faith in driving equality, dignity, and respect in our communities. After all, which faith teaches hatred, exclusion, and negative stereotyping? The Dalai Lama puts it well when he says, "Love and compassion are necessities, not luxuries. Without them, humanity cannot survive." In 2017, in the midst of the recovery from Cyclone Winston, it was determined that there was data that showed the exclusion of sexual minority groups, as a result of which Oxfam in Fiji commissioned research titled Down by the River Research, which explored the challenges, needs, and experiences of sexual and gender minorities and how their rights, needs, and strengths are addressed in disaster risk reduction and humanitarian responses. The findings of the research captured the lived experiences of sexual and gender minorities and how these experiences have been shaped and influenced by the socio-cultural, economic, and political environment around them, including that of religion. It highlighted the deep systemic levels of stigma and discrimination of sexual and gender minorities and what they face, and how religion has shaped the attitudes, beliefs, and behavior of communities towards sexual and gender minority groups. Specifically, a common rhetoric has been to shift blame on people of diverse sexual orientation, gender identities, and/or expressions for natural disasters, saying that their sinful ways had brought around God's wrath on the people in the form of cyclones and then the COVID-19 pandemic. Some of these attitudes have been documented by the Rainbow Pride Foundation, an evidence base that has proven effective to demonstrate to churches as to how people are targeting people of diverse sogi, using harmful religious narratives. The research had key recommendations that called for increased dialogue between LGBTIQ CSOs and networks and the different religious organizations in Fiji for ways to discuss issues of stigma, discrimination, abuse, violence, and bullying of people of diverse sexual orientation and gender identities and expressions. The Building Bridges with Faith Communities project in Fiji started in 2018, and the Rainbow Pride Foundation began meeting with the leaders of Christian faith-based organizations through the Fiji Council of Churches. It was then agreed that the Rainbow Pride work directly with the Fiji Council of Churches on the Building Bridges with Faith Communities project, and a series of meetings and dialogue followed. The stories being shared allow for difficult but necessary conversations between the two groups, and collectively they identified strategies to address issues which were raised. And in June of 2020, the first ever socialization workshop for faith leaders brought together church leaders and LGBTIQ representatives and collectively developed an 8-point action plan that maps the way forward as to how churches can effectively engage. You will hear details of the outcomes of this necessary discussion from the Fijian member on this panel. However, some outcomes which are equally relevant to COVID-19 and its impact on our societies include the demystification of the myths and misconceptions of LGBTIQ, the development of a theological paper on radical inclusion and love, and a glossary translated into the Itoke language on sogi. Fiji has therefore seen much progress in this respect, but this is not a time for complacency. Fiji's constitution for the first time protects against discrimination on the basis not only of sex and gender, but also on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. However, attitudes which demonize LGBTIQ are often hard to shift and dislodge in communities in Fiji which are fixed to conservative and traditional reliant-based. Yet the work done so far demonstrates that shifts are not impossible, and that the commitment of the leaders of churches is crucial to teaching equality, dignity, and love from the pulpit. Without leadership, and specifically the leadership of faith leaders, on an issue which is often projected as a moral, a religious issue, the building of a just society which is inclusive and which ensures the full participation of the sexual and gender minorities will not be achieved. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, such leadership, building on dialogue and understanding, is even more crucial. Thus, the importance of this side event. I am proud to speak at this event today and to set out the important work done in my country in partnership between the SOGI activist groups and representatives of churches. But you have come to hear those on the coalface of this important struggle and not from me. I would like to finish these remarks with the following comment made by Reverend James Bhagwan, a faith leader in Fiji and General Secretary of the Pacific Conference of Churches, whilst working with Rainbow Pride. He said, "We must resist the temptation to demonize or scapegoat certain communities, countries, or people. COVID-19 is not a foreign disease. It is no one's fault. Thank you, and I wish you well."
Thank you, Ambassador Khan. Thank you very much for your opening remarks. And we will stay with our first speaker. We'll stay in Fiji. So I welcome Dr. Leli Darling, Indigenous Fijian transgender woman, medical doctor, and founder of Transgender Fiji Network, an overseas organization for the human rights of trans, queer, non-binary, and gender diverse Fijians. So I'd like to ask you, how was the impact of faith on sexual and gender diverse population during the COVID-19 pandemic in Fiji? Leli, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Caroline. Bulavinaka, everyone. Greetings. Namaste. Assalamu alaikum. It is a great pleasure and a great honor to be here. And I'm indeed grateful for the opportunity and the platform accorded to me today as a representative of the LGBTIQ community in Fiji. I also remember my brothers and sisters in my small Pacific Island states and neighbors, as our issues are very similar. So talofa, maloelele, maori, and hello olgeta. I would also like to pay tribute to all indigenous tribes of the world whose lands, sacred soils, and islands we collectively stand on today, and to their ancestors past, present, and future. Also, big bula vinaka to Ambassador Nazat Shamim and for her speech and all her team in Geneva. Thank you for the assistance to today's program. Please note that I will be using the terms gay and LGBTIQ+ to interchangeably mean sexual and gender diverse minority populations. Fiji is an island state of faith, where every citizen have a religion of some sort and some degree of faith. Over 60% of Fiji's population are Christians, and that includes almost 100% of the indigenous population. The rest of Fiji are Hindus and Muslims. Muslim and Hindu voices are largely silent in the homophobic and transphobic verbatums in Fijian society. It's the indigenous Fijians who are the loudest in their vilification, othering, discrimination, judgment, and ostracization of LGBTIQ people. But one must always count their blessings first. And in Fiji, we are thankful that gays are not systematically hunted or murdered on our streets. And as Ambassador Shamim Khan has just said, our 2013 Fijian Constitution protects sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression as prohibited grounds of discrimination under our Bill of Rights. However, gay marriage and its discussions is shunned currently by the state, all religions, and majority of the people of Fiji. Our Christian churches are still welcoming gay people through their doors, but the biblical dogmas are largely non-affirming inside the church. Similarly, indigenous culture and tradition are welcoming, but one must abide by strict gender and traditional roles. Thankfully, we still live in a society in Fiji where most parents will still love their gay children, regardless. However, the rise of radical evangelical Christianity is increasingly putting a strain on the family kinship, and many gay children have found themselves on the streets. COVID-19 has been a great social equalizer, bringing every Fijian back onto earth, and the basic principles of survival became the main talking points. Over 20% of our population lost their jobs instantly as COVID-19 closed borders, and this includes a lot of LGBTIQ people. Faith, unwittingly and unsurprisingly, have become revisited, reconfirmed, reaffirmed as people turn to divine intervention for solace and direction. And this includes LGBTIQ people of faith as well. Many believe that the pandemic is fulfilling its prophesied place in the gospel of the end of times. Some Fijians have openly blamed gays for invoking the wrath of God in the form of the pandemic, adding to the already overflowing basket of homophobia and transphobia, both online and offline. Our organization, of which I am a founder, called the Transgenders Fiji Network, opened a Facebook chat page in the middle of COVID, trying to encourage our members to harness the power of prayer and the inspirational verses of the Bible. A passing comment from me to our members back in that time that we may start our own church was picked up by a newspaper reporter, and we woke one Sunday morning to the glaring headlines, transgenders to open their own church in a local newspaper. The fallout was immediate and damning, and thank God, was mainly an online phenomenon. But it was an eye-opener because most Fijians, including LGBTIQ people themselves, reacted as if we had no right to form such a church, no right to carve our own pathway to Christ outside of the anointed path through mainstream churches. This is probably the first ever such headline to grace Fiji's media since our independence from Britain in 1970, and probably the first introduction of this country to the idea of an LGBTIQ inclusive, affirming, or LGBTIQ-led church. I consider this a rare silver lining amongst dark, angry clouds. COVID-19 has also ushered into the Fijian society an interesting spiritual awakening, spearheaded by a group of Fijians who registered themselves in 2017 as the Lotu Vanua, translated as the Church of Our Land. Through their Facebook page, they have grabbed the attention of Fijians like never before. They are calling the Fijian back to how our ancestors used to be before Christianity came to our shores in the 1800s. They assert that the indigenous Fijian society prior to Christianity worshipped their natural surroundings, much like Shinto of Japan. And we were already a functional, effective, and spiritual society. There was no need for these practices to be labeled as evil, pagan, ungodly, and subsequently replaced by Christianity. In fact, they assert that if indigenous Fijians had preserved and maintained their ancient traditional beliefs and practices, modern-day Fijians would be in a better spiritual, physical, and emotional shape today. The spiritual leader of this group engaged in 2 separate online live debates with leaders of 2 major Christian evangelic organizations in Fiji, specifically calling out the ugly reality of pastors and churches getting opulently rich while the congregations remain in poverty. The debates went viral online, and offline discussions even took place in remote rural villages. Our Prime Minister was
come to an end, Leila. You have to come to an end slowly.
Okay, all right. So what we are seeing, I'll just end with this paragraph. So what we are seeing is a new normal where Fijians are questioning their faith and their theology. It is encouraging from an LGBT perspective because we are hoping that people will wake up and focus their attention on justice, fairness, and humanity, and not the literal translations of the Bible and weaponize it towards the LGBT community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leli darling. Thank you for these insights on the Fijian society and for highlighting how faith-based rhetoric has been used against minority communities. Our second speaker is Pearl Wong, who is the director of Queer Theology Academy in Hong Kong, a deputy convener of Covenant of Rainbow campaign toward a truly inclusive church, and a member of the Global LGBT Coalition Group. My question for Pearl are, what does social distancing do with people, in particular LGBTIQ people? And what are the consequences of invisibility of LGBT people in the public? Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. First, social distancing cut off LGBTIQ people from their caring communities and interconnectedness. According to a recent survey conducted in May this year, 860 LGBT plus in Hong Kong respondents suffering from probable clinical depression rose from 29% before the COVID-19 pandemic to 32%. Respondents suffering from general anxiety disorder rose from 24 to 28%, according to a paper on the survey published in the medical journal Psychiatry Research. Some 4% respondents reported that they have frequently experienced family conflicts arising from their sexual orientation due to social distancing that can encourage people to stay home. More than 34% also said that the pandemic had reduced their connection to the rest of the LGBT plus community, where they were most likely to find peer support. Caring communities are essential support network to LGBTIQ plus people who are forced to cope with discrimination and shame because of their sexualities. Education and experience sharing in a supportive environment can foster positive attitudes towards issues such as depression and anxiety disorder. The caring community can arrange different workshops and creativity courses to stimulate body, mind, and spirit. The inn in the Good Samaritan parable is an analogy of a caring community in providing interconnectedness. In caring for the wounded person, the Good Samaritan did not do this on his own. Rather, the innkeeper and the inn itself are part of a community in caring for the wounded. Together, they work as a team to care for the needy. The role of the inn is equally important as a shelter for the wounded where healing takes place. The parable emphasizes the interconnectedness between the carer, the care seeker, and the place that houses God's love. Freud's psychoanalysis of individualism and separation as human development has tremendous influence on dominant socio-cultural norms. Karen Horney argues that human beings, especially women, need one another for caring and love. In Genesis 3, the departure of humanity from Garden of Eden represents humanity's separation from God. And this separation causes separation from our true selves and from others. God is in relation with humanity, and it is in our relationship with God that enables us to connect with ourselves and others. The interconnectedness can be re-established in a spiritual shelter, a caring community where LGBTIQ plus people seek healing from woundedness, affirm their sexualities, and restore wholeness and well-being. Second, many events have been cancelled because of the COVID-19, and that includes two major LGBTIQ plus events held annually in Hong Kong. Hong Kong Pride Parade advocates LGBT plus rights, protect against discrimination, and legal recognition of same-sex relationships. Pink Dot Hong Kong has been an annual event for the past 5 years, organized for LGBTIQ plus and their families, allies, friends, and colleagues in support of diversity and love equality. Inspired by queer biblical scholar Robert E. Long, I assert that visibility of LGBTIQ people in the public arena has the following significances. LGBTIQ plus people affirm diversity and sexualities, gender identities, and expressions. There is no doubt that we exist in our society and in our church. We only become invisible when some people choose to ignore our existence by silencing us. By coming out, we proclaim a full respect of sexualities in human life. Furthermore, the redemption and liberation experienced through the encounter of LGBTIQ plus Christians with Christ affirm that we are created in the image of God, created for life with dignity and worthiness. We also bear witness to God's inclusive love. The existence of LGBTIQ+ can liberate the Bible and our Christian tradition from a homophobic world. Queering hermeneutic transgresses the restrictive interpretation that terrorizes and oppresses, to restore its rich text to transformative action for change. Finally, I share the impact of national security law in Hong Kong. Using the 2019 protests as an excuse, national security law came into effect on July 1 this year, which is totally destructive to the welfare of a free and open society of Hong Kong. This law threatens democracy, freedom of speech, and basic human rights. The lives of the marginalized groups become more vulnerable, and this includes LGBTIQ+ people. Christian communities in Hong Kong are concerned with freedom of religion. We are concerned that LGBTIQ+ people of faith will be intimidated from speaking out on issues regarding their rights and welfare. Nevertheless, as Christians, we continue to take a prophetic role. To do justice, to love kindness, and walk humbly with God. I pray that our hope and love will take away fear. Thank you.
Thank you, Pearl, for pointing out to impacts and also of the health regulations during the pandemic, and also of talking about the newest laws in Hong Kong. We now move on to experiences from the African continent to Kenya. Ishmael Bahati is the Executive Director of PEMA, Organization to Advance Human Rights of Gender and Sexual Minorities. He is a co-founder in both PEMA Kenya and the Center for Minority Rights and Strategic Litigation. He is also the co-chair at the board of Global Interfaith Network and board member in the Gay and Lesbian Coalition of Kenya. I'd like to ask you, in Kenya, as in other African countries, there is the belief within certain communities that homosexuality is imported from the Western culture. What does this belief to LGBTIQ people, in particular during the COVID pandemic, and what is the role of religion in all this?
Thank you very much. I must say that over 7 months now, COVID-19 has impacted the world as a whole harshly, and LGBT persons have not been spared either. In some cases, religious leaders have been blaming LGBT community for the COVID-19, as people believe that COVID-19 is a calamity and a punishment to the world from God because of homosexuality. As hard as the situation might look, some faith leaders within the areas of operation have provided solace for the LGBT community in their messaging clips and offering counseling for those who need the counseling services from religious leaders. This has changed the narrative that faith leaders are always against LGBT community. On the day of judgment in Kenya on the repeal 163 and 165 of the Penal Code of Kenya that criminalizes same-sex between men, for the first time ever, the religious leaders who we work with were present in solidarity with the LGBT community and a demonstration that a lot is changing within the faith spaces. Considering that this happened during the Islamic holy month of Ramadan, which comprises over 70% of the region where PEMA Kenya operates, the coastal region of Kenya. Even with the coming of the COVID-19, the faith leaders have shown their unwavering support for the LGBT person, not only by sharing sermons clips, but also by calling in to know if the LGBT community are safe. We will never forget this. However, in some communities in Africa, they still hold on the myth that homosexuality is an imported culture, Western culture, even when there are proofs enough to prove that homosexuality existed in Africa way before colonialism, and that homophobia in itself is in fact imported to Africa. This has resulted to excommunication, rejection of the LGBT persons by families holding to punitive colonial rules. For example, the Penal Code of Kenya 163 and 165 that criminalizes homosexuality. This has seen the increase in LGBT refugees, including in my own country, Kenya, where we have over 200 LGBT refugees who live in pathetic and deplorable situation with no access to basic needs such as specific LGBT health services. Access to COVID relief fund is impossible as there seems to be no intentional structure to facilitate this support. the hostility in the camps against the LGBT is on another level, with attacks being the order of the day, and the little properties and shelter they have being destroyed every now and then. This attack has been justified by religious refugees who believe that by punishing the LGBT counterparts, they are doing religion a favor. It is sad that at this age and time, violence is still, in the name of protecting faith, is justified and seems okay in the eyes of many. I am still a believer in faith, and therefore believe that faith leaders can mitigate and make situation better, as it is their responsibility to be hospitable to strangers and foreigners, lest what befell Sodom and Gomorrah befall us as a country. The faith leaders must extend the support they offer to the local LGBTs that are refugees. The institution mandated to protect the rights and lives of refugees, including the LGBT refugees, such as UNHCR, Refugees Affairs Secretariat, has been silent on the violent method on the LGBT refugees. And this in itself is an indication that attacks are somehow justified. There have been no interventions from the Kenyan government authorities, who are very aware of the situation through the agencies to protect the LGBT refugees. Generally, there has been no intentional intervention both from UNHCR and the government of Kenya to respond to the plights of the LGBT refugees. I have recommendations to which I think that would work in making lives of the refugees and the LGBT community better, even during this time of COVID and post-COVID. We demand that the UNHCR and the government of Kenya work out a formula that will allow the LGBT refugees to become urban refugees. This basically is refugees who live out of the camps to minimize attacks. Also calling to well-wishers to help fundraise to support towards supporting the relocation of LGBT refugees. The government of Kenya to respond to the violence against the LGBTs and offer protection. Let all of us add to the voices to make UNHCR listen and offer protection to LGBT persons in the camps. To support, we must also stand up to support research on lost history of existence of homosexuality in Africa pre-colonialism. We have to offer support to religious leaders and allies who are supporters of LGBT community in hostile countries. And with this, I say thank you very much, and I hope we find a way to make things better for the LGBT community, both in Kenya and Africa at large. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ishmael, for these recommendations and also for highlighting the situation of LGBT refugees. Our next speaker is Anwar, a trans-Muslim activist from France. He's working in Transgender Europe, the largest trans-led organization in Europe and Central Asia, where he's a community building officer. So could you tell us more about the impact of COVID-19 to trans people, and how is anti-rights faith-based rhetoric used against sexual and gender minority communities? Please.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for inviting me to this, of course, very inspiring event, very needed space as well. It's a pleasure to be with you today and listen to everyone's input on behalf of TGEU, but also as myself, a trans Muslim advocate. So regarding your question, Caroline, trans communities we're working with, so in Europe and Central Asia, are indeed disproportionately affected by the COVID-19, and we have reasons to believe that they will continue to be affected by its aftermath. We can already see clearly that those who are the most marginalized are out of job, experiencing homelessness, forced to shelter with abusing relative, and so on. Many community members have been reporting that they need very basic necessities such as food, toiletry, medical supplies, especially during lockdown periods. What we see right now, and as it was already highlighted by the other panelists, is that the current COVID-19 pandemic is emphasizing the structural inequalities our societies are based on, and how these are impacting most marginalized communities. In the case of transgender people, this impact is felt most severely by trans people who are homeless, sex workers, disabled, refugee and/or asylum seekers, poor and or elderly. They are negatively impacted by the virus itself. Of course, we know trans people are more likely to have existing health condition and economic instability than the general population due to the discrimination we face. Secondly, by the healthcare system and healthcare providers, We know that trans people are worldwide facing barriers when accessing healthcare systems. Thirdly, by the socio-economic impact of this crisis. Due to the various COVID-19 related restrictions, most vulnerable trans communities are going through additional economic hardship on the top of already major struggles our communities are facing with employment. But it's also, those communities are also impacted by the political impact of the crisis. And that's the issue I would like to focus on today with you by highlighting how COVID-19 has been an opportunity for the anti-gender movement to use anti-rights, faith-based rhetoric against trans people's rights. While the most marginalized trans communities are among those most impacted by the crisis, some governments are using the pandemic as an excuse for violating trans people's human rights. And for instance, since the beginning of the outbreak in the region, so around March 2020, we're witnessing a series of major rollbacks in the recognition and protection of trans people in the region. We are documenting signs of a wide range of political and legal rollbacks, all leading towards more systematic discrimination against trans people. To name only a few, the outlaw of legal gender recognition in Hungary, the amendment on the age limit to access legal gender recognition from 18 to 21 years old in Kazakhstan, the project on denying trans people access to rights as legal gender recognition, again, marriage or the right to raise children in Russia, but also worrying development that I won't go into detail with in Belarus, Poland, Spain, the UK, and so on. For us, as an analysis, this is the result of a dangerous radicalization of what we call anti-gender movement, meaning that most of these rollbacks have been pushed by political groups or parties who draw their resources from coalitions of conservative and religious forces, spreading hateful discourses using faith-based rhetoric and blaming trans people for the COVID-19. As my other co-panelists shared, a communication strategy that is particularly efficient in times of global panic. We need the UN itself to step up and stop this conservative rollback, including in the international human rights system. But for this input, this presentation that I'm sharing with you today, is also important for me to bring some light in this worrying situation and talk about positive queer-led and faith-based narrative we really hear about. And as myself a trans Muslim social justice advocate, it is important for me to reclaim these religious narratives and build and share positive queer-led stories. I do believe that faith provides us with tools to support our struggles and enable us to rise up against oppression. In France, for instance, I'm part of queer and trans Muslim initiatives fostering inter and intra community solidarity based on those theological exchanges. In this case, for instance, how Islam invites us to fight power dynamics and promote solidarity and social justice. And as an example, and I will finish with that, as an example of concrete action during the last Ramadan, we have been supporting one of the largest in the region trans-led redistributions of food and medical supplies to further marginalized trans communities during the lockdown, trans sex worker, trans migrants, and so on. It's quite a revolutionary act, as it counters not only faith-based transphobic rhetoric that the anti-gender movement is spreading, but it also counters the French Islamophobic narrative deeply rooted in Western European colonialism. This strongly supported narrative in France is framing religion on the one hand and queerness and trans identity on the other hand as incompatible, and depicts Muslim people as the barbaric, homophobic, and transphobic people we queer and trans Muslim have to be protected against. So here again, we need the UN to firmly stand against racist and Islamophobic scapegoat discourses in Western countries, and focus on the concrete challenges and violence our queer and trans communities are facing: unequal distribution of resources, economic exploitation, borders control, police brutality, racism, sexism, and misogyny. And as my time I know is already running out, I'll stop now, but I'm happy to discuss more about this particular topic during the Q&A. Thank you everyone for your attention.
Thank you, Anwar, for this overview, also anti-gender movements during COVID-19 and the legal and political rollbacks in Europe and Central Asia, as well as the impacts in particular for trans and gender diverse persons. We now move on to the second round, and we want to look at ways to resist, how to face the growing authoritarianism and fundamentalism, and how to bring about inclusive systemic change. Our next speaker is Reverend Kakay Pamaran. She's a pastor in the Philippines and serves as Director of Communication at the Union Theological Seminary. She's also adjunct professor in Scripture and Interpretation and co-chair at the board of the Global Interfaith Network. Kakay, what can you tell us about state repression and what is happening against voices of dissent now in the Philippines? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. I can tell you a lot about this. The Philippines ranks 66 out of, 99 countries in terms of suppressing the coronavirus pandemic. Curiously, our next door neighbors, or 7 out of 10 of the ASEAN member countries, are in the top 10 for their stellar performance in virus containment and the management of this health crisis. Countries like Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, they performed very well. Usually when you visit the rice-eating regions in our neck of the woods, you get to say same, but different. This is no longer the case for us where the coronavirus pandemic is concerned. Our neighbors are doing a lot better than we are. Is this a health protocol compliance problem? Maybe yes, maybe no. I don't know. Our Department of Health is still sorting out a lot of non-pandemic related corruption issues and scandals, and maybe they are too preoccupied to continue advising the public on these matters. So we do not have a clear answer. What I do know is that we currently hold the record for the longest COVID-related lockdown in the world, which started on March 16. If anyone wants to contest that, that's fine, but at least the longest, one of the longest lockdowns. What I also know is that people in my country cannot stay home because they don't have homes. And people cannot work from home because, aside from the fact that they don't have homes, they also do not have work. So even with the longest lockdown in the world implemented enthusiastically by the police and the military, our COVID numbers still keep rising. People get arrested and fined for violating protocols. Some arrests are even quite violent. The other thing I know is that the lockdown does not apply to everyone. The rich and famous, public officials, even one infamous police chief, they throw parties and social gatherings, but none of them were ever arrested. They even publish their photos in social media platforms, and the rest of us, so that we can see them. No physical distancing, no masks, no arrests. First, I thought this was a rich and poor matter. But around a week ago, the Department of Environment and the Department of Tourism opened their crushed dolomite white beach in a small section of Manila Bay. Manila Bay is black sand usually, but they opened a section and they put crushed dolomite. They're spending a lot of money. And people rushed to behold the white sand, common people, but none of them were arrested. But last July, an LGBT group called Bahaghari, which is rainbow in Tagalog, held a pride protest in Manila in the midst of the lockdown to call for systemic mass testing, a more systematic response to the needs of people living with HIV whose medications had to be collected in the same hospital where COVID testings are done, and to junk the then anti-terror bill, among others. This group of people, this Bahaghari, complied with safety protocols during the rally, the pride protest, and they were wearing face masks and face shields. But all of them were violently arrested and illegally detained for days. I am compelled to conclude that this lockdown has been weaponized against dissent. The pandemic has been used to curtail democratic freedoms, even if these expressions comply with health and safety protocols. The Philippines also has one of the longest running revolutionary movements in the world, around half a decade old. Filipinos, Filipinas, Philippines value their democratic freedoms and freedom to express dissent. Faith, and I say this to mean the institutional Christian faith, has always been part of this struggle for just and lasting peace in the Philippines. For example, in the 1986 EDSA revolution, nuns, priests, pastors, and all sorts of church workers knelt in front of army war tanks to keep these tanks from pushing forward. Nuns placed flowers in the barrels of Armalites. They prayed the rosary in front of riot police. To this day, church workers continue to conduct community outreach advocacies and programs in the countryside, among the poorest urban communities, among fisherfolk, among farmers, to stand with them in solidarity and accompany them in their struggle. My personal experience was performing a Eucharistic ritual in front of a steamroller and a bulldozer to keep the heavy equipment from demolishing an urban poor community. The presence of people identified with the institutional faith systems is important to a country which claims Christianity as the state religion, where 87% of the population is Christian, 80% Roman Catholic, and 7% mainline Protestant. For example, when me and my colleagues in the seminary go to any rally in our ministerial attire, such as this one, we immediately find ourselves in front of TV cameras. But when we show up in plain clothes, we get beaten up along with the rest of the rallyists. So it is not surprising for these faith and church people to be vilified, red tagged as communist. The state is very allergic to the C word or terrorist or what have you. But just like any other country, not all church people are like this. Many of us continue to be neutral in matters which require us to take sides. Many church leaders cite separation of church and state when it comes to socio-political economic issues. Many church leaders even cite scripture to justify their neutrality or support to an oppressive regime. And not just this regime, but the many regimes before this. So in the Philippines, the faith communities can be roughly grouped into four. The majority being the conservative or the passive people, pretty much, well, the folks that I just described. Those who participate in issues only when it affects them, like internet connectivity or how informal settlers throw garbage in rivers or something like that. Two, those who tend to isolate themselves from the worldliness of it all. This is a very small number of them, and many of them live in small communities. And three, the progressives. And four, the militant. The fourth being the least popular and probably the most persecuted. When 2, 3, and 4, even if they banded together, will never outnumber the first group. And between the progressives and the militants, even a fewer number will go to a pride march. So if you can imagine, I speak here in behalf of a very small sector of the Christian religious. Union Theological Seminary, where I work, has consistently been sending pride contingents for almost a decade. We are also the only mainline Protestant seminary in the Philippines with a Center for Gender and Sexuality and whose core curricular offerings include babaylan and feminist theologies and special courses on queer theologies. Our seminary president himself is a proponent of a paper called Toward a Theology of Struggle. All this is based on our core values and institutional commitments for choosing sides and always choosing the side of those whose hopes can only be realized through struggle and faith. This faith confession and commitment has a very, very public aspect to it. Our deep solidarity with the peasant farmers requires us to work the fields with them in contested farmlands and negotiate with state forces when matters escalate. Our deep solidarity with urban poor requires us to go to where they are and live with and into their experiences. Our deep solidarity with the LGBT people requires us to be public about our support in pride marches, in Senate hearings, in public theological discourse.
Please come to an end, Kakay.
Sorry, okay, thank you.
No, please come to an end, just you can finish your talk.
Okay. Yeah, I'm about to be finished. Public theological discourse. All these are done in the light of a simple analysis of oppression. I have a few lines left, so please bear with me. Done in simple analysis of oppression. One, we see, judge, and act based on 1, class oppression, 2, gender oppression, 3, national oppression. Most of the time, we learn from the communities we serve to engage God talk in the light of the suffering of the people and the injustices committed against them. Last year, and I'm coming to a close now, Caroline. Last year in 2019, One of the leaders of the organization of peasant farmers in one of the communities that we serve approached me and asked, "Pastor, can you please explain Saji to us?" I asked, "What?" "Saji, Pastor. You know, the one about gays and lesbians. Because I think one of our members is gay and we want to understand him and help him." The peasant leader meant Soji, of course. So we took them to attend the 2019 Pride March, around 60 or so of them. We arrived 2 hours earlier to discuss what Pride is and what Soji is. And because they were organized peasant farmers with a very good grasp of land justice and agrarian reform issues, they quickly picked up the most salient points in the sharing of Pride and Soji. It was probably one of the easiest smooth sailing Soji class I've ever taught. All of them nodded and said, "Okay," we marched with them. LGBT ministries have a very public aspect to it. It requires prophetic public witness. In the era of military implemented lockdowns, it has become extra difficult to do that. COVID-related lockdown as implemented by the state did not just isolate us from each other, it prevented us from performing a most sacred task, and I speak here as a pastor, to be in physical solidarity with those who are struggling for life, liberty, justice, hope, and peace. Thank you for letting me
Thank you,
finish.
Kakay. Thank you for your input on weaponizing the pandemic and for highlighting the situation in the Philippines. We now travel to Lebanon, and there is Tarek Zeidan, who is a sexual and bodily rights activist from Beirut, Lebanon. He's the executive director of Helem, the first LGBT rights organization in the Arab world, founded in Beirut in 2001. So Tarek, how can one begin thinking about introducing faith to conversations about LGBTQ issues and vice versa, if this happens in a religiously charged environment? The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Caroline. Thank you, everybody, for this wonderful opportunity to discuss this issue. It comes rarely, so it's a pleasure to be here. Lebanon is a faith-based but highly sectarian society where faith leaders are political leaders and vice versa, and where the religious and political elite share control over policymaking, decision-making, legislation, and resources. And much like the case of the Philippines, faith has been chronically deployed to crack down on dissent or attempt to dissolve dissent, the most famous example of which has been the Lebanese revolution that started in October of 2019. Now, the situation facing LGBT people in Lebanon is already precarious. Not only do we face, colonial era contra naturam legislation, as well as spiking levels of domestic and security-based violence, but of late it's been the socioeconomic rights violations against our community that have had the most acute effect. Lebanon, I might remind everybody, is also plays host to approximately 1 million Syrian refugees, many of whom are LGBT and many of whom have come to our center and have become part and parcel of our community here in Beirut. To add, the lockdown and that the entire world has been suffering from comes to Lebanon also at the same time as the revolution itself, as well as an acute economic and political crisis, and which has, created a whole new slate of challenges for us, including increased poverty, lack of access to healthcare, employment, shelter, and something that very rarely we speak of, which is the mental health crisis that seems to be developing into a chronic one. To add to all of that, on August 4th, there was a massive explosion that hit Beirut, some 600 meters away from the headquarters of Helem, which happens to be in the heart of the most LGBT inclusive area of Beirut, which was devastated by the explosion. Many individuals lost their homes, lost their jobs, what's left of their jobs, and the heightened security presence also meant many members of our community had to leave the area. So unfortunately, like many of my colleagues mentioned, faith-based organizations and leaders were among the first to not only blame LGBT individuals for the COVID-19 pandemic, but also for the blast itself, saying that the explosion happened was because, quote, Lebanon has a much higher concentration of homosexuals than all other countries in the region, hence that's why the city blew up. Now, in the midst of all of this gloom and doom, sometimes the universe sends you some hope. And that happened a little bit before the explosion on June 18, in the aftermath of the death of a colleague and a very well-respected activist from Egypt, Sarah Hijazi, who I'm sure my colleague Noor from Egypt will speak a lot more of later. But just to say that a video emerged on social media from a webpage called SheBeFeed, which is very similar like BuzzFeed. And it's a religious sort of progressive page with a lot of following of a young man called Joe who runs the page, who was asking Sarah to forgive him and forgive other people of faith for driving her to pass away by committing suicide a week earlier. The story of Sarah Hijazi, very briefly, is that she was one of the people that raised the rainbow flag in that very infamous incident in Egypt back in 2018, and she had to leave Egypt because of the mental and physical torture that she went through while incarcerated in Egyptian prisons, and she took her life a few weeks before that video turned up. So it was really unprecedented for a well-known person of faith on a very well-known page to ask for forgiveness of her and of other people in the LGBT community who, quote, he said, we're so sorry to have made you relinquish life or made your life a living hell. And as a page that follows the teachings of Christ, we can disagree on sexual matters, but we have to agree that what happened to Sarah is unforgivable and inconceivable and should never happen again. Now, interestingly, two things happened when this came out. First of all, it caught us by surprise that anyone would say something like this, particularly in such a charged environment, and particularly because Sarah was a very well-avowed communist and atheist and had committed suicide, which a lot of people of faith in the region thought to be an sort of added insult to injury on top of her being queer and a woman. And so, we first of all attempted to support this individual, which was met with a lot of consternation because many of the organizations that did were quote unquote secular, and therefore our support was not very useful to this person at that point in time. And the second was that it really sparked a debate in a, again, sectarianly charged Lebanon on social media as to whether it was fundamentally Christian to forgive and to be LGBT inclusive and not Muslim, and how Islam would never allow it, but Christianity would. And that also led to another sort of conversation that we weren't ready to have, which is how can you avoid the LGBT rights movement, and particularly this issue of being seduced by the more problematic of socioeconomic dynamics in a country? How do you avoid LGBT rights and LGBT issues of faith of being dragged into the sectarian swamp that is Lebanon? How do you manage that? And we've been thinking a lot about how can an institutionalized response be in order to create this sort of, I believe the word was concrete utopia that our colleagues invited us to think about. And at Helem, we decided that we have to start from the premise to admit that a lot of religion is muddled up in culture and in politics. And one of the first steps that we need to think of is how do we start untangling faith from culture and politics? And how do we start resurrecting an idea of faith and understanding of it without all of this quote-unquote excess baggage? And we've distilled this sort of operation to three fundamental realizations, which is reimagining and renegotiating three key relationships. The first is the relationship of people of faith with themselves, and then second, a relationship between them and others, and third, a new relationship or a renegotiated relationship with text or scripture. And the way we've decided to start tackling this issue is by first recognizing that it needs to come from the community, it needs to be grassroots, it needs to be negotiated on a regional level. I say this because a lot of our brothers and sisters and siblings in the West,
please come to an end,
will do, have had some success in renegotiating these relationships within sort of a third culture context, but it hasn't had the same impact here in the part of the world where many of the Abrahamic religions started. So At Helem, the idea came that what you really need to do right now is create spaces where LGBTI people of faith can come and negotiate these relationships with themselves and others and emerge as a public and visible voice, a credible voice that can address these issues. Second is our family support program, which deals exclusively with families and friends of LGBT individuals, particularly those of faith, and which through faith-based conversations have been key in getting families, particularly mothers, to accept their children and counter the rhetoric of faith-based organizations and leaders in the public sphere. And finally, the really massive need for added academic and intellectual engagement on issues of LGBT issues in the region, particularly from a faith-based lens, in order to get the much needed information and data that we can base policy and programming on. Thanks.
Thank you, Tarek. Thank you also for these concrete recommendations and concrete utopia. From Lebanon, now we travel to Egypt. We come to Noor Sultan, who is the co-founder and executive director of Bedayaa organization, which works to promote sexual orientations, gender identities, gender expressions, and sex characteristics rights in the Nile Valley area in Egypt and Sudan. Noor is furthermore the MENA representative at the Global Interfaith Network Board. Noor, what would you say are some tools that faith provides us with to support inclusion? And how could we face the rising authoritarianism with it?
Thank you. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you very much for the co-organizer of this side event and for everyone who contributed in organizing this panel. It's such a pleasure to be with you today. Faith and spirituality are an important component of many individuals' life. Some see it as part of their overall makeup along with their physical and intellectual and emotional self. Taken together, they comprise the whole person. I think understanding of religion and spirituality to ground thinking in the area as we work on micro and macro level is crucial. Many times spirituality and religion are thought or taken to be the same. Spirituality is a commitment to choose and as a primary context of understanding and acting one's relatedness between oneself and other people, one physical environment, and to a higher power or God. It places relationship at the center of awareness, where there are relationships with the world or other people, or relationship with God or other non-material beings. While religion represents a culture codification of important spiritual metaphors, narratives, beliefs, ritual, social practice, and forms of community among a particular people that provide methods of attaining spirituality, most often expressed in terms of relationship with God or with God of that religion. What I wanted to say from this, that spirituality and religion focus on relationships of the person with others, God, whether this other is God or other power or person or surrounding environments. So understanding others, where others come from and feel compassion is one of the important tools. Many faiths is investing or inviting us to think and understand before judging or making assumptions or take actions. On the other hand, tolerance as a fair and objective attitude toward those whose opinion and practice differ from our own. Tolerance is tolerant in this sense is an intellectual virtue as well as an ethical one. It requires an effort to be objectives and understanding those who are different from ourselves, to try to raise above irrational bias and to seek the fullness of truth and spirit of humanity. Tolerance enables us to debate those or these differences in a civil and non-violent manner, and debate that is necessary for the development of enlightened and just public policies for progress and resolving distributed issues. The values of tolerance and acceptance are extraordinarily strong tools that faith can provide for inclusivity. All faith has different principles that faith is based on, principles of justice, equality, and common among different faiths. Different faiths has different tools that can support inclusion of our community. The most important, how to use these tools to bring this inclusion. The different tools can be used to open more conversation and also those tools can help us to analyze the current religion discourses and building arguments on religion-based bigotry causes enormous harm to people and violate human dignity. Also, to challenge these tools could help us to challenge the harm itself, but not the persons or institutions. I think it's important also to use personal stories and experiences like Tarek, for example, mentioned the Sarah Hijazi stories. It's a very important, and it brought some changes after. Also, it's important to use these tools to engage the movable religious middle in the conversation and to emphasize on religion values and principles that I mentioned before, the value of tolerance and justice in every speech and work that we do. And at the end, and finally, celebrating our achievements is a very important to remind ourselves of our achievements from time to time. Thank you.
Thank you, Noor, for these helpful advices. And from Egypt, Sudan, we now come to Poland/Russia, to Misha Cherniak, who is an Orthodox Christian and gay activist, musician and interpreter, born in Russia and living in Poland. He is a board member of the European Forum of LGBT Christian Groups, involved in its advocacy, research, and capacity building. In 2016, Misha sent an open letter on behalf of Orthodox LGBT persons to the Holy and Great Council of the Orthodox Church, pleading the church leadership to acknowledge the existence of LGBT persons within the church and establishing a dialogue. Misha, what did you achieve with your open letter, and how would you say can faith help to bring about deep, inclusive, systemic change?
Thank you, Caroline. Yes, dear distinguished colleagues, Your Excellencies, first of all, let me say that it's a great honor to be part of this conversation. And indeed, I am /Poland/Russia because I'm right now in Moscow and I'm sending you my greetings. Now, answering your question, Caroline, on the surface of things, the letter I wrote to the Orthodox Church Council in 2016 on behalf of the European Forum of LGBT Christian Groups and on behalf of myself and other Orthodox LGBTI persons has not brought any significant direct changes. The bishops did not write a response or even openly discuss the letter during the council. Partly because the agenda for the council had been set back in the 1970s, partly because they knew how different they are in their opinions on sexual diversity. But what that letter has really achieved is opening up small spaces of dialogue. Here and there, people of different levels finally started discussing those issues because the question was finally and very publicly put on the table and was now hard to ignore. The Orthodox Church lives in a modern world and cannot pretend to be separate from the social dilemmas. It cannot claim to have no LGBTI members or relatives of LGBTI persons who are increasingly unsatisfied by the current approaches of the Church. And so those pockets of dialogue have indeed opened up in the years after the letter. At least I can name at least 5 prominent academic seminars over the last year, including a very large-scale one in Oxford in August 2019. And while I wholeheartedly praise these attempts to establish the space for dialogue by the academia and LGBTI persons and activists, I cannot also omit the fact that there is a counter trend that is very active and has only gathered momentum this year due to COVID dynamics. I'm talking about the shrinking space for that dialogue. As Caroline has said, I'm coming from Eastern Europe. I grew up in an Orthodox family in Russia, and I've lived for 9 years in a predominantly Catholic Poland. And there are a lot of similarities between those two countries, surprisingly. In terms of LGBTI rights, Russia has been a problematic area for at least 7 years since the passing of the infamous anti-homo propaganda law. Poland has joined the club of countries where LGBTI phobia is institutionalized by the authorities of all levels more recently. I'm talking about the situation that you probably have heard of. It's a situation around the so-called LGBT-free zones, areas whose local parliaments have passed resolutions either claiming these areas to be free from so-called LGBT ideology, which is a non-existent phenomenon and definitely a dehumanizing term, or areas promoting family values in a very narrow understanding of what family is and aiming at prohibiting anyone from redefining what family is. 1/3 of Polish territory is now under that LGBT-free spell, creating an atmosphere as far from dialogue as possible. Just try to imagine how a queer teenager must feel growing up in such area, hearing that they are deviants, and ideology and not people, as the president of Poland has said in the last month, or quoting one of the high-rank Catholic hierarchs, a rainbow plague. Those local resolutions also make it impossible to have special contact persons in schools for LGBTI youth or actually have any local support initiative. Besides steering this wave of LGBTI-phobic resolutions, extreme right faith-based fundamentalist groups like Ordo Iuris, which is connected to other European and global political alt-right groups and with alleged connections to Kremlin, and also their hardcore pro-life colleagues have initiated a collection of signatures under 2 pieces of legislation. First one last year was called Stop Pedophilia and was in fact equating homosexuality and sexual education with depraving children. The second one this year is aimed at banning all pride and equality events. These legislation proposals are actively promoted by special vans driving around Polish cities covered with slandering posters about LGBTI persons as pedophiles, and also using sound equipment to broadcast that message around. What is the reaction of the Polish Roman Catholic Church, which claims to still have the support of at least 80% of the population? Instead of really dealing with the issue of pedophilia among their own clergy, they choose to promote those collection of signatures almost as if it were a diversion tactics. And this is happening right now every Sunday or even during weekdays in hundreds of parishes around the country. The Catholic hierarchs of Poland also wrote a 27-page long document that has gone further in ruining any dialogue attempts of us as LGBT Christians in Poland with actually any other local Catholic church in the world. They went further than any. They used pseudo-scientific language, and in fact they have advocated for conversion therapy centers being opened by every diocese. They suggested also things like detransitioning for trans persons. They claimed their position belongs to the unchangeable core of the teaching of the Catholic Church, which is of course not true. So coming to an end, slowly, how does this affect LGBTI persons? And is there in fact any hope? Is there even a chance of faith bringing about systemic changes in these circumstances? Paradoxically, yes. In 2020, 2 trends contributed to a very interesting effect. Churches as institutions turned out to be even more rigid, excluding, and off-putting than expected, and not just in terms of being LGBT-phobic. My Polish Orthodox Church decided not to change anything in terms of how people receive communion. The whole parish is given it with only 1 spoon that is not disinfected or anything, which has driven loads of people away bewildered. At the same time, COVID locked us down at homes, barring us from attending church services altogether. So the most common reflection which we as an organization have observed in groups of LGBTI persons of faith globally and in our region is a question how to organize as a self-caring community, how to continue practicing our faith in these new conditions. It turned out that the new situation made us much more creative and has raised our level of agency and subjectivity. Queer people of faith, especially in Eastern Europe, who used to feel that they are either not welcomed or not more than tolerated by church institutions, now increasingly realize that they are not at the receiving end of things. They are the church. They are the community. They can hold online services. They can decide to go bolder to treat sacraments officiated by friendly priests online through Zoom, for example, remotely, through their screens. They can treat those sacraments as valid, or they can even choose to officiate sacraments themselves as lay people. which is a daring and a new perspective for a setting of traditional churches like Orthodox or Catholic. And yes, in some cases, this brings people closer to embarking on a non-denominational journey. But in some cases, people, I would say in most cases, people are simply empowered to be more independent from the church structures in accepting and affirming themselves. The only thing that makes me sad in this process is that while faith is once again empowering people and driving change, the institutions of religion are becoming increasingly ever more blind and eventually irrelevant. And that is a shame. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share these short reflections from Eastern Europe alongside my colleagues from the whole world. Thank you.
Thank you, Misha. Thank you for highlighting the agency of queer people of faith and pointing out ideas to bring about change. Our last panelist before Victor Madrigal-Borlos is giving the concluding remarks is Nicolás Panotto, who is Argentinian based in Chile. He's a theologian and earned a PhD in social sciences. He is also the director and founder of the multidisciplinary study group on religion and public advocacy. Dear Nicolás, could you tell us what tools do we need for the construction of a narrative that would project us into the future? And what is the place of religion in this?
Okay, thank you very much, Caroline, and it is an honor to be here sharing with you these ideas and of course learning from you as well and from your experiences. Well, from the different perspective that we could analyze this complex context in Latin America, I would like to highlight one of the issues that as civil society organizations in the region has occupied us the most, and that is the violation of rights of population groups. The necessary public health policies implemented by various governments did not take into account the specificities involved in working with minority groups such as indigenous peoples, LGBTQ community, Afro-descendant groups, or even religions. In some cases, for example, discriminatory practices were even promoted, such as the case of leave based on gender identity, which granted different departures days for men and women, leading in different countries to situations of violence and arbitrary arrest for trans people. If we analyze the actions of religious groups in this context, or rather the treatment of religious issues in general, we can identify the following elements. First, that of course, religious communities have taken on a central place in the Latin American political environment. Governments have held meetings with interreligious groups to show unity and to appeal to the importance of spirituality in facing the widespread crisis. But also, as it has happened in many other continents, as we have heard during this meeting, we also can identify neoconservative and fundamentalist groups that have raised a condemnatory rhetoric towards population groups, especially towards the LGBTQ community, as the originators of these situations, either in the name of immorality or as a divine punishment. For example, pastors in Chile argue that the pandemic is a punishment from God because of the immorality that the region was charging for passing, for example, in these recent years, equal marriage laws, or because of the advance of the so-called gender ideology. In countries such as Argentina and others in Southern Cone, hate speeches groups where fundamentalist evangelical groups participates, denounce a supposed conspiracy theory led by gender ideologists who, through health policy, they will say, seek to impose practices of social control. Another fact to highlight is the capacity of articulation and visibility that neoconservative and fundamentalist religious sectors have had in relation to groups of hate speech, such as individuals denying the reality of COVID-19 or anti-quarantine and anti-vaccine groups, as we have seen, for example, in Argentina, in Brazil, in the United States, or other countries. And in third place, the issue of laicism has also emerged in several occasions. First, as a response to governmental actions in relation to health policies applied to religious groups, especially with regard to the restriction of assembly. Several conservative groups, such as the case of evangelical churches in Chile or Catholic groups in Colombia, claimed that such actions violated the principle of religious freedom and that churches should be given special consideration in terms of restrictions. In summary, we are able to identify two elements about the place of religions from its relationship with socio-political fields in this pandemic context. First, it has shown the limitation, stereotypes, and reductionism of the concept of laicism, religion, and secularizations that many government and even civil society handle in the face of the social place of religious communities. And secondly, it has made even more evident that the existing polarizations within the religious field and its political instrumentalization, which has strengthened the relationship and the visibility of institutional and hegemonic discourses, predominantly conservative, putting once again the population groups, especially the LGBT community, in a place of complete vulnerability. Based on these questions, I believe that there are two fundamental elements to take into account. First, that we need to make visible other voices, religious voices within civil society. Unfortunately, the perspectives that are most publicized tend to be the most conservative, which gives a distorted image of the religious world, since it leaves out an important set of other positions, discourses, and practices committed to the values of plurality, diversity, and inclusion. For example, in Latin American context, a group of religious organizations committed to human rights form the Coalition of Beliefs, Religion, and Spiritualities in Dialogue with Civil Societies, where each year participate in the assemblies of the Organization of the American States, the OAS, especially the so-called multilateral dialogue with civil society, together with the state's representative, where the coalition worked with other coalitions, including the LGBTQ, sexual and reproductive rights, women, and network of civil society organizations for human rights, among others, working side by side for inclusive agenda from a pluralistic and democratic perspective. This experience has not only allowed for installation of the multilateral Latin America agenda of voices that are generally silenced in the religious world, but also working together with civil society on the promotion of and defense of human rights. And second, and the last point, is that we need to promote concept of secularism, laicism, and religious freedom in the key of human rights, and articulated from a constitutional, legal, and public policy dimension. The current conceptions give rise to an instrumentalization of neoconservative and fundamentalist sectors in order to legitimize a supposed place of privilege of certain groups in religions, and from there promote instances of discrimination and exclusion, mainly toward the LGBTQ community. We need a concept of laicism, of secularism, of interreligious and pluralism that not only demarcates the frontier between state and society, but also promotes another vision of religion in public sphere from an inclusive and plural conception. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicolás, for these insights from South America. I just want to the participants that are still over 70 right now, that you can still send us your Q&A here in the Q&A section. Please address it to panelists. And now I'm very much looking forward to the concluding remarks by Victor Madrigal-Borlos, the independent expert on protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, short UNSOG expert. Victor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and thank you very much to first of all, Tony and Simon, who have arranged so brilliantly this exchange. To you, Caroline, for your very able facilitation of the meeting. And I also would very much like to thank Ambassador Khan for her opening remarks. I think it's actually quite extraordinary in the way that we see how political discourse matters when it is supportive and when it's actually highlighting the importance of accompanying some of this work, of course, in the political sphere. Now you say that I'm going to be doing the concluding remarks. I'm afraid that I don't think I'm going to be able to do that, because I don't think that this is a conversation that can be concluded upon today. I actually think I will be doing some sort of opening remarks in a way, having into account the enormous wealth of information and opinion that has been shared around the screen today. And in fact, it invites us to further reflection as to how to further this work. I'm not surprised. We know that this is a conversation that is as big as human aspiration itself. And therefore, I'm not at all surprised that it should be more of a start than a finish. Allow me then to, under the guise of musings or starting points, try to place some observations in relation to the wonderful, wonderful conversation that we've been having today. The first one, I've been extremely interested at the common thread that I think can be drawn on the idea that when speaking of impact of COVID-19, we are indeed speaking of the reality in which LGBT persons have lived their whole lives. And as we all know, COVID-19 is none other but the exacerbation of social exclusion and discrimination that has existed in the context in which LGBT persons have their lived experiences. And therefore, when speaking of COVID-19 is pretty much speaking of a reality seen through the magnifying glass of the pandemic. As my colleague Hilal Evel brilliantly put it, COVID-19 is inequality on steroids. And therefore, what we are doing is we are describing the inequality that has historically been felt by communities, peoples, and populations in a way that actually allows us to observe it, perhaps, in a way that is magnified and, of course, deeply felt in the lived realities of persons around the globe today. Having said that, there is a reality which is that all of this, both in general and in relation to COVID-19, appears to relate very much to reclaiming religious narratives and reclaiming the notion of agency. And I was very, very interested in how a number of the interventions around the screen today are actually making reference to what I have called processes of cultural criminalization. This is a phenomenon described by Farrell, according to which there is a mediated reconstruction of meaning and perception around culture and crime and sexual orientation and gender identity through the presentation and representation in the realm of sound bites, shock images, news conferences, and newspaper headlines that creates a mediated spiral, generating images and images of images, which basically tend to try and demonstrate that LGBTB and gender diverse persons are fundamentally immoral. And this is one of the crucial elements that I've gathered today from so many of the interventions, but I will pick up on Nicolás's last intervention and Misha's as particularly representative to this point. The idea of creating this notion that LGBTB and gender diverse lives are somehow immoral is of course not new, but it is actually, as was mentioning by Reverend Pamaran, it is instrumentalized in the context of the pandemic to actually create a new echoing chamber of that message, and therefore weaponizing not only the pandemic, but also pandemic response in relation to these issues. We all know that all of this is conducive to the creation of otherness, the creation of the idea that LGBT persons are not quite human, not quite healthy, not quite moral, not quite able to be good citizens, not quite able to be transcendental beings. And in this, I think it's a great point of connection, of course, with the topic presented today, which is the reality that in this notion of transcendence lies a particular connection to the ability of people of being spiritual. And of course, something that I believe is what we were talking about when so many of our colleagues today were talking about the reclaiming of this agency of people of faith. Now, as you can imagine, my mandate has concerned itself with impact of COVID-19 very much since the beginning of the pandemic. I want to be very frank in that at the beginning, I was a little bit disconcerted, not knowing exactly what to do in the presence of such a large-scale phenomenon that we knew was going to have life-changing consequences. We have gathered and heard many views around the board, and we actually have come to the conclusion that there are three fundamental impacts of the pandemic that we should be concerned about. The first one, direct attacks that actually have been using the pandemic as an excuse to actually further attacks against the community. And as we were talking about, and Reverend Pamaran was very ably explaining, weaponizing the pandemic in order to create persecution. The second one, indirect discrimination as a real risk, measures that may not necessarily have at the outset discriminatory intent, but because they are designed without particular participation of the communities or consultation with the communities, end up having a particularly discriminatory impact. One example of this type of measures, unfortunately, is the participation of religious and community leaders in distribution of hygienic and food supplies, for example, that in many cases turn out to be crossed by discrimination all over. And finally, of course, the third realm being that structural inequality to which our colleague Anwar, for example, was making such reference, and Tarek as well, in relation to these issues. Now, I want to let you know that in relation to these types of impact, I have created a framework called the Aspire framework, which aims at signaling a number of recommendations to states as to how COVID-19 response can be carried out. Aspire, of course, is a mnemonic device answering to 6 calls that I've made to states, those being the idea that acknowledging the existence of LGBT persons and acknowledging that they are a valuable part of the social fabric. S for supporting LGBT communities. And on this, I want to actually underline the points made by Leli on how support to organizations are fundamentally important part of this voyage, as I think she was describing very much this whole transition towards inclusion. And also Misha was making a reference to this point. Now to Misha's point about the shrinking of civil society, I've always captured Cynthia Rothschild's wonderful expression, civil society space are not shrinking, they are actively being shrunk. And the reality is that there is a purpose behind the shrinking, the active shrinking of the spaces. There is an intentionality before the active shrinking of the spaces. And that is, of course, taking out the support not only to these organizations, but also the support that these organizations can lend to others. P in Aspire stands for protect LGBT persons from persecution. And I think that in that case, Ishmael Bahati's point was actually very well taken. It is important that we understand and see the examples provided not only by Ishmael, but by Anwar, by Reverend Pamaran, in relation to specific attacks that have been perpetrated in the context of COVID-19, utilizing the pandemic as an excuse to further other agendas that otherwise were seen to be politically unviable at a particular point in time and are at this moment being rescued under the aegis of the pandemic response. I is for indirect discrimination. As I was mentioning, there are measures that even if they didn't have a discriminatory intent at the beginning, will have discriminatory impact because they were designed without having the communities in consideration when they were designed or implemented. R is for representation. Nothing about us without us should be the point where governments actually design measures with the active participation of LGTB persons. And E is for evidence, to ensure that all measures are actually supported by evidence. That's the Aspire framework in relation to this. Now, I wanted to connect this with what was being said around the existence of particular persecution by...
You come to an end, please, and wrap up.
Thank you very much, Caroline. I wanted to connect this with the idea of what are the tools that are available in relation to actions by churches. And I wanted to let you know that there is a recent report by my colleague, the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion and Belief, where he is actually making an analysis of historical trends of discrimination and violence, also perpetrated within the context of faith-based organizations. And he's making, I'm sorry, he's bringing to relevance the idea that religious groups may have a role in perpetuating norms that promote gender inequitable attitudes, and that this is a complex phenomenon because, of course, religious communities themselves are not monolithic. And he takes point in what I know very well to be the case because of organizations and networks like Jinsogi, in that a multitude of voices exist within religious groups and institutions, including, of course, faith-based organizations who work from the point of view of inclusion. But there is a vigorous framework that ensures that even within religious organizations, there would be no trespassing into the rights of others. And the idea, of course, is that freedom of religion and belief is not absolute. It does have a limitation in the particular discrimination risk of others. Institutional autonomy does not extend to state deference to harmful discriminatory gender norms, and it does not oblige states to defer from intervening to prevent harmful practices because they are informed by quote-unquote religious ethos. In reality, it is important to take this report of the Special Rapporteur of Freedom and Religion and Belief and actually reconcile it with many of the ideas that were very ably being expressed around the table today. I would like to end like the way that I started, thanking all of you, not only for the creation of this space, but for the nurturing of this space, for ensuring that this conversation is kept alive, for ensuring that the ability of LGBT and gender diverse persons to conceive, perceive, and defend their identity as spiritual, transcendent beings is part of the conversation as well within the human rights space. In this, as always, you know you have the accompaniment, the support, the humble respect of the mandate of the independent expert. Thank you very much, Caroline.
Thank you very much, Victor. And since we have several delegations here, I now open the floor for the Q&A section. And we have a question from the representative of the delegation to the UN of Canada, Rory Routhap-Hearn. If you want, we can make you visible so you can pose your question yourself. Right.
Hi, thank you very much, and thank you to all the panelists today. We're very happy to be co-sponsoring this virtual side event. So I have a bit of a statement and then a question. But so as the panelists have highlighted, we of course have to recognize that many situations of exclusion, discrimination, and violence are further aggravated by the COVID-19 pandemic. We see this particularly with regard to rising food and shelter insecurity, disruptions in accessing healthcare, increased exposure to violence, and serious impacts on mental health and well-being. It's troubling that religion has been and is still being used to justify homophobia and transphobic violence and exclusion on the basis of of sexual orientation and gender identity. While the right to freedom of religion or belief and LGBTI rights may seem to be at odds, we actually believe they're intimately linked and mutually reinforcing. As a human right, freedom of religion or belief aims to facilitate the free search and development of faith-related identities of human beings as individuals and in community with others. It should not shield religious traditions or religions against criticism, nor does it protect members of religious communities from critical questions. The problem arises when these two human rights are pitted against one another and when aspects of one are used to violate the principles of another. So I guess the question is, what can we do to ensure that freedom of religion or belief is not used as a pretext for violating the rights of others, and how can we work together with faith-based organizations and LGBTI organizations to promote that message that these rights have to work in harmony and not against each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I propose to gather 3 questions. We have another question from the delegation to the UN of the Netherlands, Danielle Drost. If you want, you can pose it yourself. So maybe we can ask, does it work? No? Right. We can.
Caroline, maybe move on to the next question, and we'll try and gather the Dutch question.
We have a question from Ambassador Khan from the delegation to the UN of Fiji. And she asked, what is the role of the law in protecting LGBT? Most faith organizations still perpetuate discrimination. And I was wondering whether there are any tools lawmakers can use to address the issue. So in answering that, I wonder if somebody, maybe Victor, you want to take it up? It's about law.
Of course, and I'm just sad that I'm going to continue to talk since I already talked so much, Caroline, but thanks for the invitation. It's a great question. The reality is that we could conceive this as a series of concentric circles when it comes to the legal analysis. So allow me to try to describe this in a very general way, of course, knowing that we could go very much into detail, but I will try not to do that. There are 3 at least levels of analysis in relation to this. One is the fact that there is a vigorous protection against discrimination under international human rights law that deals and creates a robust framework for dealing not only with rights, but with the boundaries in which rights meet. I believe that human rights are never, ever in conflict with each other, but there are situations where they narratively may appear to be in conflict, and clearly right to freedom of religion and belief and sexual orientation and gender identity is a good example of that, given that so many religious institutionalities insist that particular sexual orientations and gender identities are, again, I will repeat my point, somehow immoral from their point of view. The reality is that, as my colleague Ahmed Shahid, the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion and Belief, has so well established in his report, nothing in the protection of religious belief allows religions to discriminate against others. And nothing allows the state not to take vigorous action when the particular action of these faith-based organizations is going and actually creating a violation of the human rights of an LGBT person. Also, there is an importance in distinguishing, of course, between the ability of persons to conceive themselves as spiritual beings, but also to leave particular religious denominations when these religious denominations are hostile to their very existence being free and equal. And this is something that Ahmed Shahid develops very well in his report. He details his findings in relation, for example, of economic dependency of persons and the conditions that it creates sometimes of making it very difficult for people to leave communities of faith in relation to this. So there is a framework when it comes to dealing with the boundaries between religion, the right of religious freedom, and of course sexual orientation and gender identity, and protection from violence and discrimination. But allow me to add 2 sentences. The first one is also in relation to COVID-19. The pandemic is something new, but states of exception are not something new. And so I want to stress in the context of this conversation today that there is a vigorous framework of international human rights law establishing what are the conditions under which measures can be adopted in the context of an emergency. And those conditions are, of course, that measures need to be necessary. They need to have a connection with the stated objective in relation to the emergency, and they need to be proportional. And all measures in relation to COVID-19 need to follow that test. So when many of our colleagues were actually given examples around the screen on measures that have no connection to the pandemic, but are being used in the context of the pandemic, they have that component. And finally, the adoption of measures to answer, to respond, and to recover from the pandemic need to follow a human rights-based approach. What does this mean? It means that they need to follow the principle of non-discrimination, they need to follow the principle of transparency, the principle of accountability, and the principle of empowerment. So we exist in this topic, Caroline, at the point of meeting of these 3 concentric circles. And to Ambassador Khan's question as to what is the role of the law in relation to this is to establish the boundaries of those frameworks. My contention that I share with you today is that the framework is there to deal clearly with all of the issues. We just need to find our way to navigate to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor, very much for this answer. And we have also several co-organizers that I would like to give the floor. First, Elaine Neuenfeld from ACT Alliance, if you'd like to pose your question or say your comment. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for this event, and thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to co-sponsor the event. ACT Alliance is an alliance of faith organizations, church-related and churches itself, alliance of 135 members, and mostly Protestant and Orthodox churches, denominations are part of it. We are very much in support and with the gender program that we are developing, we are very much affirming that gender justice and gender diversity and gender identities in general are part of our faith identity. And in its 2018 Assembly, ACT Alliance affirmed this in a public statement saying that all members should engage in continued dialogue based on love, trust, transparency, to strive towards a change in society norms, harmful attitudes about gender roles, about gender identities, including masculinities, reproductive choices, human sexuality, stigmatization in general. We as churches and faith-based organizations in this alliance, we have a long history of accompaniment of communities in vulnerable situations, in humanitarian work, in development and advocacy. We are concerned about the persistent violation of rights of women and discrimination against LGBTQI communities and groups. we are equally concerned about how that links to a broader profiling of human rights in general. We denounce and we work against the trends of fundamentalisms, religious, political, and economic, which promotes messages that are incompatible with human rights and with the good news of the gospel, the good news of the Bible and theological texts that are reinforcing the idea of love against all sexual, sexist stereotypes, and that goes against women's rights and sexual diversity, of more tolerance and love. So we are very much supporting this event. We are very much working together with all organizations and members that are working in dialogue and transparent participation towards enhancing the faith approach that is inclusive and that it's including and open, embracing all diversity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elaine. And I have heard that Netherlands, the delegation of Netherlands is back, and I would like to call upon Daniel Drost to make the comment, please.
So good afternoon, everybody, and yeah, thank you to all the speakers for all their valuable insights. To me, that's very useful. I've just started in my new function as a policy officer here in Geneva, working for the Dutch permanent representation of the Netherlands. As the Netherlands, we are quite active on the on all matters that are related to LGBTI. And at the same time, I don't want to ask a too politically correct question, because I was also perhaps wondering if I could spark a bit of discussion, perhaps, by posing the following question that I have, which is, on one hand, I mean, I've heard several speakers mention that the separation of state and religion might be a good way forward to really systematically influence the situation right now, the impact of faith on the LGBTI community. But on the other hand, we all know that faith in itself has a very large, how do you say it, legitimacy base. So I was wondering, like, I mean, all states, they know that we have to address COVID, of course, but religion as such is something that is perhaps a bit more, it is ingrained in our culture as well. So how does that then, how does that specific part influence this discussion? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are over time, and I have the information that we still have 8 minutes and a lot of questions and comments. So I would like to have somebody answer this, if possible, very short, and then we go on with Andrew Duplessis, who is the executive director of ILGA World, who is still here, I hope, and finish with the next. So please, Nicolás, can you just give a quick...
Yeah. I just wanted to make a short comment on the question on was posed by Canada, just because that's one of the questions we actually have here in Latin America, have taken a lot of thought on organizations and faith-based communities. Just 3 points from the perspective of religion for freedom. First of all, I think we need to deep in on our concepts and understanding of religion. Usually in the political environments and civil society, we have a concept that is focused on an homogeneous and institutional way of looking to religion, but we need to pluralize and make more complex and to note the diversity within religions in terms of different perspectives and theological positions and so on. Secondly, I think we need to talk about religious freedom, not just from the responsibility, for example, from state and political groups to religions, but also from the responsibility from religions to society. So that's why I think we need to talk about freedom of religion from a human rights perspective. And the last point is that we need also a concept of laicism and secular states in terms of plurality and human rights and democracy, that the state has also a responsibility of convocating different perspective of religious groups that are within a society.
Thank you. And thank you. And we have Anwar for a quick answer.
Yeah, thank you. I will try to be super short, and it also as a response to what the Canadian delegation raised as a question, and maybe it will sound a little bit simple, and that's what I like about this gathering, is that my answer would be quite simple, is to give more space, resources, time to queer people with faith, because I think, and I will talk about only the West, like the country, like the context I know, which is Muslim and Islam in Western contexts. And most of the time, because we have a lot of those, like, dilemma in mind, like just bringing forward these further marginalized experience are a really good way to actually have a very priceless insights and in-depth expertise on how to navigate those identities or those situations that can really be depicted as very incompatible. And freedom, your question that freedom of religion is how to be sure that freedom of religion is not used as an argument to discriminate against LGBTI people. Queer people with faith deal with that on an everyday basis. So when you have in front of you someone who say, I am queer and I am Muslim in my case, you actually have a very interesting opportunity to deal with and to exchange with someone who actually know how to navigate those. I just wanted to share that.
Thank you, Anwar. And since we are over time, and I've heard some have left, I'd like to give concluding words to Tony Kruger-Ariel-Bazidle from the Global Interfaith Network before I then say also my goodbye.
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you, everybody. I think this has been an incredibly rich discussion. And I am with Victor in feeling that really this must be the beginning of a conversation, because it's impossible. It's impossible to take the richness that has been shared in the last hour and a half and pack it nicely, and there we go. It's like there is no way. What I do want to pick up on, I think, is that I've heard various people talking about the need to complexify the relationship between faith and culture and society, the relationship between faith and law and policy, the relationship between faith and state power. And I think that that's my takeaway from this whole conversation. And I think that for quite a long time, people have thought that it was a simple relationship in some respects, and particularly when it comes to LGBTI people, gender and sexual minority people. But in fact, we are seeing more and more clearly, and through the voices of all of you, that this is not a simple relationship. That these relationships between faith and these various other forms of power, ways of thinking, are not simple relationships. So I would like to thank all of you very much for being willing to be here, to share your thoughts, to share your understandings of your contexts. I think this is an incredibly rich discussion, and I am fully certain that as Jin, we will continue to make these spaces, to continue this conversation. And I hope that in your various contexts, you will also connect with us, connect with each other, connect with other people to continue these conversations. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Victor. Thank you, Ambassador Khan. Thank you, representatives from various states. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Tony. And thank you to the Global Faith International and the other co-organizers. Let's mention them again: ACT Alliance, Church of Sweden, CUC Netherlands, and ILGA World. And I also like to thank the delegations to the UN of Canada and Fiji, the co-sponsors, and of course the UN SOGI independent expert, and of course all of you who participated at this very enriching side event. And we noticed that 90 minutes was much too short. We should have made it 140 from the beginning. So I thank everybody who joined us today, and take care and bye-bye.